The air in the private wing of the Mount Sinai Morningside was a thick slurry of bleach, ozone, and the metallic tang of blood, my blood. It tasted like rusted copper coins sitting on the back of my tongue. I lay paralyzed, a prisoner inside a carcass that had once been the envy of Wall Street. Pancreatic cancer had been an efficient, silent liquidator. It had dismantled my body with the same clinical precision I once used to dismantle failing tech firms. My skin felt like wet parchment stretched over a cage of brittle, yellowing bone. Above me, the ventilator made a rhythmic, sighing sound. Hiss, click, thud. It was the only percussion left in the soundtrack of my life. Julian stood at the foot of the bed. He looked revoltingly healthy. The fluorescent lights caught the sharp crease of his charcoal Brioni suit, a garment paid for by the dividends of my 2018 Quant fund. He wasn't looking at me. He was focused on the dial of his Rolex Cosmograph Daytona. I watched his thumb slide over the platinum clasp, the mechanical click echoing against the sterile white tiles of the room. It was the sound of a man counting down the minutes until an inconvenient meeting finally ended. 10 more minutes, Dad, Leo said. He was leaning against the wall, scrolling through his phone. Asher is already texting. Chloe says the traffic near Columbus Circle is a nightmare. If the trust distribution isn't triggered by 4 p.m., we're going to lose the deposit on the Hamptons estate. The name hit me like a physical blow, though my nerves were too dead to register the pain. Chloe Devereux, my dear friend, the woman I had spent 10 years pitying because she was a struggling single mother. Julian finally looked at me. His eyes were like 2 pieces of polished flint, cold, hard, and devoid of the warmth he had faked for 25 years. He reached out and adjusted his silk tie, the fabric rasping against his crisp white collar. You've been a magnificent fiduciary, Elena, Julian whispered. He leaned over me, the scent of his Tom Ford oud wood, a fragrance I had bought him for our last anniversary, filling my nostrils. It was an olfactory insult. Truly, you managed the Vance family estate with a brilliance I've always envied. But a trust is like any other investment. It eventually reaches maturity. And you, my dear, have reached your expiration date. I tried to move. I wanted to wrap my withered hands around his throat and squeeze until the silver fox arrogance left his face. But my muscles were water. My vocal cords were dry husks. All I could do was stare into the abyss of his betrayal. The twins, Julian continued, his voice a low, intimate crawl. He gestured to Leo and Asher. They've grown into fine young men, haven't they? Such a shame you spent 25 years believing the lie about Greg's tragic car accident. There was no Greg. There was no distant cousin. Asher looked up from his phone, his face a mirror image of Julian's. He had my eyes, or so I had thought. Now I saw they were Chloe's, sharp, predatory, and vacuous. They're mine, Elena, Julian said, his smile widening into something jagged. Chloe and we started the year before our wedding. I needed a woman who could give me heirs, and I needed a woman who could give me a fortune. You provided the latter. Chloe provided the former. It was a perfectly hedged bet. A hairline fracture seemed to split my consciousness. 25 years of my life. The sleepless nights during Leo's kidney transplant, the hundreds of thousands I'd paid from my personal inheritance to settle Lucas's fraternity embezzlement scandal, deposition I'd declined at Harrison and Croft just to bake organic cookies. All of it was a meticulously curated fraud. I was the venture capitalist of my own destruction. The power of attorney you signed last week was the final piece, Julian said, his fingers grazing the plastic tubing of my ventilator. The Vance Trust unlocks the moment the attending physician signs the certificate. It's a clean liquidation. Leo walked toward the bedside. He didn't look at me as his mother, the woman who had stayed up through his night terrors, but as a barrier to his liquidity. He reached for the heavy medical-grade power cord that tethered me to the world. The reservation at Le Bernardin is for 8 o'clock, Leo muttered, his voice flat. Asher checked the Venmo. Did the lawyer confirm the filing fee? Done, Asher replied, his thumb tapping the screen. Julian gave a curt, infinitesimal nod. Leo's hand closed around the black rubber of the plug. I watched the tension in his forearm. I watched the way the light caught the fine hairs on his knuckles. He didn't hesitate. With a sharp, decisive jerk, he pulled the cord from the wall. The silence that followed was more violent than a scream. The ventilator's sighing stopped. The hiss, click, thud vanished, replaced by an urgent, high-pitched electronic whine from the backup battery. Then that too faded into a low, mournful drone. My lungs burned. It was a cold, searing fire, the sensation of a vacuum forming inside my chest. My vision began to fray at the edges, the white room dissolving into a swarm of gray pixels. Finally, I heard Julian say. His voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. Check her pulse. Then call Stone. Tell him the asset is ready for transfer. The last thing I saw was Julian turning his back to me, his hand already reaching for his phone to call Chloe. The last thing I heard was the flat line, a long, continuous note that signaled the end of Elena Vance, the fool. Darkness rushed in, absolute and freezing. I expected the void. I expected the silence of the grave. Instead, I felt a violent, jarring sensation like falling from a great height. My lungs suddenly expanded, drawing in a sharp, desperate gasp of air. It wasn't the sterile, filtered oxygen of the Mount Sinai wing. It was warm. It was thick with the scent of expensive vanilla candles and the deep, roasted aroma of Arabica beans. My eyes snapped open. The glare of the afternoon sun was blinding, filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows. I wasn't lying down. I was sitting. I felt the plush, familiar texture of the beige mohair sofa beneath my palms. I looked down at my hands. They weren't skeletal. They were full, the skin smooth and radiant, a 5-carat diamond ring catching the light on my left hand. I was wearing a silk blouse. A crisp, white, $2,000 piece of Italian couture that I knew, with a sickening jolt of memory, was about to be ruined by baby vomit. My heart hammered against my ribs, a strong, healthy, 24-year-old heart. I grabbed the phone on the glass coffee table. It was a silver flip phone, heavy and archaic. The screen glowed with the date, October 14, 2001. The heavy oak front doors of the penthouse swung open with a familiar, authoritative thud. The sound of 2 infants screaming, sharp, demanding, and discordant, tore through the silence of the living room. Julian walked in, his hair perfectly tousled in that practiced, tragic hero look he had mastered. In each hand, he carried a plastic baby carrier. Behind him stood Beatrice, her face already masked in a rehearsed expression of grief, her hand clutching her pearls. "Elena," Julian breathed, his voice trembling with faked emotion. "Thank God you're home. Something horrific has happened." I sat perfectly still. I didn't rise. I didn't cry. I simply watched the man who had murdered me 25 years from now. A clinical detachment settled in my chest, precise and freezing. Julian set the carriers down and moved toward me, his arms open for the hug that had, in another life, sealed my fate. He expected the grieving, soft-hearted woman he could manipulate for decades. He didn't know that the woman sitting on the sofa had already seen the flatline. He didn't know that the golden goose had returned from the grave with a scalpel. I waited until his hand was an inch from my shoulder before I spoke the words that would dismantle his world. The twins were screaming in a key that set my teeth on edge, a jagged, high-frequency assault that vibrated through the baccarat crystal sconces on the walls. In my first life, this sound had triggered a frantic, hormonal surge of empathy in my chest. I had seen 2 helpless souls and felt a crushing duty to protect them. Now, as I sat on my mohair sofa, the sound was merely data. It was the acoustic signature of Julian's greatest fraud. Julian stood in the center of the foyer, the weight of the plastic baby carriers straining the fabric of his tailored blazer. He looked like a masterpiece of manufactured grief. His eyes were artfully bloodshot, his jawline shadowed with exactly 2 days of sorrowful stubble. Behind him, Beatrice Sterling moved into the room with the predatory grace of an old money vulture. She adjusted her strand of Mikomoto pearls, her eyes scanning the penthouse, calculating the square footage of the life she intended to colonize. "Elena," Julian said again, his voice cracking with a precision that would have won him an Emmy. "I'm sorry to burst in like this. I've been at the morgue for 6 hours. Greg and his wife, they're gone. The interstate was a slaughterhouse. These boys have no one. The social workers were already talking about foster care, Elena. Foster care." He waited for me to gasp. He waited for me to fly off the sofa, take the carriers from his hands, and offer up my life as a sacrifice. I didn't move. My pulse remained a steady, flat 65 beats per minute. I looked down at the coffee table. My espresso had a thin layer of crema on top, the color of dark mahogany. I picked up the bone china cup. The porcelain was thin, almost translucent, and the heat seeped into my fingertips, a sharp, grounding reminder that I was no longer a ghost in a hospital bed. "Foster care is a well-regulated system, Julian," I said. My voice was different, lower, devoid of the desperate-to-please lilt I'd carried for years. It was the voice of a woman who managed billion-dollar acquisitions. "They have protocols for this." Julian's eyes flickered. A microscopic twitch started at the corner of his left eyelid. This wasn't the reaction he had rehearsed. He took a step forward, the plastic carriers clucking against his legs. Protocol? Elena, these are family. Greg was my blood. Lie, I thought. I watched the steam rise from my cup. Julian hadn't seen Greg in a decade because Greg didn't exist in the way Julian claimed. These infants, Oliver and Lucas, were the biological dividends of his long-term investment in Chloe Devereux. Family, Beatrice chimed in, her voice like a cello string being pulled too tight. She walked toward me, the scent of her Chanel No. 5 clashing with the vanilla candles. Elena, dear, you're in shock. It's understandable. But Julian is right. The Sterling name doesn't let its own rot in the system. You've always been such a soft, nurturing girl. It's why we were so happy Julian found you. I focused on the micro-action of the espresso. I brought the cup to my lips. The steam dampened my skin. I felt the bitter, acidic kick of the liquid hit the back of my throat, the caffeine sparking through my central nervous system. I savored the heat. I savored the fact that I could swallow without a tube down my throat. I lowered the cup back into the saucer. The clink of the china was the only sound in the room for 5 seconds. I'm not a girl, Beatrice, I said, my gaze shifting to her. I'm a managing partner at Harrison and Croft. Or I will be, once I sign my contract extension tomorrow morning. Julian set the carriers down on my Persian rug. The babies continued to howl, their faces turning a deep, angry crimson. Elena, listen to me. I know you were looking forward to the promotion, but this changes things. I've already talked to my mother. She'll help, of course, but these boys need a mother. A real mother. I thought we could be a real family now. A real family, I repeated. I felt a cold, clinical amusement rising in my chest. By which you mean I decline the managing partner offer, withdraw my candidacy for the board, and spend the next 20 years as an unpaid domestic operative for your mistress's children? Julian froze. The word mistress hadn't been spoken, but the air in the room suddenly felt like it was being pumped out. He recovered quickly. He was always a world-class pivot man. Mistress? What are you talking about? You're hysterical. The stress of the news is making you say crazy things. Let's talk about the logistics, Julian, I said, standing up. I felt the power in my legs, the sheer, intoxicating strength of a body that wasn't riddled with tumors. I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. This penthouse is a premarital asset. I purchased the title deed in my maiden name, Vance, 6 months before we even met. Under the terms of the prenuptial agreement your own lawyers insisted on, you have 0 equity in this property. None. I turned back to him. Julian was staring at me as if I had suddenly started speaking in tongues. The Sterling name might not let its own rot, I continued, but the Vance bank account isn't a public utility. I'm not adopting these children. I'm not filing the guardianship papers. And I'm certainly not quitting my job to facilitate your lifestyle. Elena, Beatrice barked, her pearls rattling against her chest. Have you no heart? These are babies. Then you raise them, Beatrice, I snapped. The sound of her name coming from my mouth without a title made her flinch. You have the Sterling legacy to maintain. Julian, take the carriers. My car is downstairs. I have a 6 p.m. briefing with the risk management team, and I need to prepare for my fiduciary duty to my shareholders. Something you wouldn't understand. You're leaving. Julian's voice rose, a note of genuine panic finally breaking through the facade. Now, in the middle of this? I'm not just leaving for the office, Julian. I walked to the hallway and picked up my briefcase. I felt the weight of it, the leather, the brass latches. I felt the keys to my Ritz-Carlton suite in my pocket. I'm leaving the narrative. You want to play the tragic hero? Fine, but you'll do it on your own dime. And you'll start by finding a new place to live by Friday. I walked toward the door. As I passed the baby carriers, Oliver, the one who would eventually pull my plug, reached a tiny, fisted hand into the air. In my previous life, I would have kissed that hand. This time, I didn't even look down. Elena, wait! Julian shouted, reaching for my arm. I stopped and turned. My eyes were flat, twin mirrors of the Manhattan skyline. If you touch me, Julian, I'll call NYPD. And unlike you, I actually know the commissioner. Don't test the termination clause of our marriage before the ink on the divorce papers is even dry. I opened the heavy oak door. The hallway was silent, a stark contrast to the cacophony behind me. One more thing, I said, looking over my shoulder. Check your iMessage. I've just BCC'd you on the email to my accountants. Your Black Amex is now restricted to a $5 daily limit. I suggest you find a cheap brand of formula. I stepped out and closed the door. The thud was final. The silence of the hallway was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I stepped into the elevator, my reflection in the polished brass panels looking like a stranger, sharp, vibrant, and dangerous. As the doors slid shut, my phone buzzed with a notification from my PI. A single photo of Julian and Chloe Devereux, taken 3 hours ago at a diner, laughing over a map of my penthouse. Julian thought he was the puppet master. He didn't realize I had already cut the strings and was currently setting the stage on fire. The lobby of the Ritz-Carlton was a symphony of hushed wealth. The soft chime of silver on porcelain, the discreet rustle of evening newspapers, and the scent of expensive lilies. I sat in the back of a town car, my laptop glowing with a cold blue light. I wasn't looking at spreadsheets. I was watching Julian's digital footprint dissolve. By 9 p.m., my corporate attorney, Marcus Stone, had already initiated the asset protection protocol. My maiden name, Vance, was a fortress Julian had never bothered to investigate. He had been too busy being charismatic to realize that every luxury he touched was merely on loan from my premarital estate. "The eviction notice is drafted, Elena," Marcus said over the speakerphone. His voice was like dry gravel, devoid of any unnecessary emotion. "Since the penthouse is a non-marital asset and he has no lease agreement, he's technically a guest whose invitation has been revoked. We're giving him 72 hours. It's generous for Manhattan. Make it 48, I said, my thumb tracing the edge of my titanium credit card. I want him out before the weekend. And Marcus? Trigger the breach of contract clause in our joint lifestyle agreement. He used my personal line of credit to fund his mistress's rent. I want a full audit of every cent he's spent since 1999. Understood. I'll have the process server at your door by 8 a.m. I hung up. I didn't feel the adrenaline I expected. I felt only a profound clinical clarity. I had to go back to the penthouse one last time. Not to talk, but to retrieve the war chest Julian didn't know existed. The elevator ride up to my floor was silent. I adjusted my silk scarf, the fabric smooth against my neck. When the doors opened, the sound hit me before I even reached the apartment. It was the twins, still screaming, though the sound had shifted from a piercing wail to a ragged, exhausted rasp. I swiped my keycard. The heavy oak door unlocked with a sharp, mechanical clack. The scene inside was a masterclass in domestic entropy. Julian was sitting on the floor, surrounded by open boxes of formula and a mountain of gray, damp diapers. He looked like a man who had been hit by a high-speed train. Beatrice was in the kitchen, her pearls clinking against a bottle as she tried to navigate my high-tech German appliances with the grace of a confused toddler. "Elena!" Julian scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hope. He had a smudge of baby puree on his white shirt, a shirt that cost $450 and required hand-pressing. "Thank God. You were right. It's a lot. My mother can't find the bottle warmer, and Lucas won't stop vomiting. I'm sorry about what I said earlier. We'll figure it out. Just help them." I didn't answer. I walked past him as if he were a piece of furniture I planned to discard. I didn't look at the babies. I didn't look at the mess. I walked straight to my private study and closed the door. The lock engaged with a heavy, satisfying thud. Inside, the room was a sanctuary of dark wood and silence. I walked to the mahogany bookcase and pulled back a false panel behind a first-edition copy of Wealth of Nations. The safe was a specialized Gardal, an 800-pound monster of reinforced steel. I placed my fingertips on the dial. The metal was icy, a stark contrast to the humid, sour air of the living room. I began to turn it. 42, right? I felt the subtle vibration of the first tumbler falling into place. It was a micro-sensation, a tiny click that traveled up through the bones of my hand. 18 left. The dial turned with a smooth, heavy resistance. I held my breath, listening to the mechanical heartbeat of the safe. 91, right? With a final, deep-seated thunk, the locking bolts retracted. I pulled the door open. Inside were the documents that Julian had spent 25 years trying to get his hands on. The original Vance family trust deeds, the physical stock certificates for my early entry holdings in the tech sector, and the private DNA report I'd had commissioned a week before my death in the future. I pulled out the title deed to the penthouse. I felt the weight of the parchment, the embossed seal of the city cold against my skin. This piece of paper was the knife I was about to twist. I walked back into the living room. Julian was standing by the sofa, holding Oliver. The baby was finally quiet, staring up at me with wide, unblinking eyes. In my other life, this would have been the moment I broke. I would have seen a child in need and forgotten the man's betrayal. Not this time. Here, I said, extending a single crisp sheet of paper toward Julian. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against mine. His skin felt clammy. He looked down at the paper, his eyes scanning the bold, black lettering at the top. Notice to quit formal eviction. What is this? Julian's voice was a ragged whisper. It's your exit strategy, Julian, I said. My pulse didn't even skip a beat. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. That includes your mother, your belongings, and the children you claim are your blood. If you are still here on Friday morning, the police will escort you out. And Julian? I've already contacted the building's board. Your keycard access has been revoked for every floor except this one, and only for the next 2 days. Elena, you can't be serious, Beatrice shrieked, emerging from the kitchen. You're throwing your husband and 2 infants into the street? In October? I'm not throwing my husband anywhere, I said, turning my gaze to her. I'm removing a squatter. And as for the infants, I suggest Julian calls their biological mother. I'm sure Chloe has plenty of room in that West Village apartment I've been unknowingly paying for. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian's face didn't just turn pale, it turned a sickly, translucent gray. The paper in his hand shook, the sound of the parchment rattling like dry leaves. How long have you known? Julian choked out. Long enough to ensure that when I cut you off, you'll bleed out financially, I said. I picked up my briefcase, the leather heavy and solid. I'm going back to the Ritz. Don't bother calling. I've already redirected your number to my legal team's voicemail. I walked toward the door. Julian lunged forward, trying to grab my shoulder, but I pivoted away with a sharp, clinical movement. Don't, I said. The word was a scalpel. If you touch me, Julian, the breach of contract suit becomes a criminal assault charge. I've already signed the power of attorney over to Marcus. He has a very specific set of instructions regarding your tech startup if you make this difficult. I stepped out into the hallway. The heavy oak door of my penthouse, my sanctuary, swung shut. The thud was a final, rhythmic punctuation to our marriage. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. From inside, the twins began to scream again, louder this time, as if they knew their benefactor was gone. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel regret. I felt only the immense, intoxicating weight of the documents in my briefcase. The trap was set. Now, I just had to watch him walk into it. I stepped into the elevator and watched the floor numbers descend. My phone buzzed. A text from Rowan Blackwell, the VC kingmaker Julian had been courting for months. Elena, Julian mentioned a family emergency. Is everything okay for our funding meeting tomorrow? I smiled, a cold, predatory expression that didn't reach my eyes. I began to type. Actually, Rowan, there's some forensic data you really need to see before you sign that check. The silk of the Ritz-Carlton robe was a cool, liquid weight against my skin, smelling faintly of lavender and the high-end ozone of a filtered ventilation system. I sat by the window of my suite. The Manhattan skyline spread out before me like a circuit board I was about to short-circuit. On the mahogany desk, my laptop hummed, a low, rhythmic bass that felt like the heartbeat of my new reality. I opened the interface for our joint account. In my first life, this screen had been a source of pride, a digital ledger of our success. Now it looked like a map of a colonial invasion. I watched the transactions from the last 48 hours. A $1,200 charge at a boutique furniture store, a $450 dinner at a steakhouse where Julian had likely taken Chloe while I was working late, and hundreds of dollars in recurring subscriptions to services I never used. I didn't feel anger. I felt the clinical precision of a surgeon preparing a graft. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I initiated the direct deposit rerouting for my Harrison and Croft salary. With a few keystrokes, the 6-figure monthly inflow that had been the lifeblood of Julian's existence was diverted into a private, high-yield vault under my maiden name. Then I turned my attention to the Amex Centurion card. The card, the legendary black card, sat on the desk beside me. It was heavy, made of anodized titanium, cold to the touch. It represented more than just money. It was a badge of entry into a world Julian believed he owned by right of marriage. I logged into the card's management portal. Julian was an authorized user with a no preset spending limit status. I clicked Manage Spending Limits. The cursor blinked, a tiny rhythmic pulse of light. I entered the new credit limit, $0. I clicked Confirm. The system processed for a microsecond, a spinning wheel of blue light, before the confirmation message appeared. It was done. Julian was now a man carrying a very expensive piece of useless metal. Across town, at the Whole Foods on Columbus Circle, I knew the trap was about to spring. My PI, Harrison, had messaged me 10 minutes ago. Subject is in the checkout line. 2 carts. Organic everything. I leaned back, my thumb tracing the silk tie of my robe. I could almost hear the sound of the supermarket. The hum of the refrigerated cases, the beep of the scanners, the polite murmur of the Upper West Side elite. Julian would be standing there, his silver fox hair perfectly coiffed, the twin carriers at his feet as a prop to garner sympathy from the women in line. He would be projecting the image of the harassed but heroic new father. He would reach into his designer wallet and pull out the titanium card. He would slide it into the terminal with that effortless, arrogant flick of the wrist. In my mind's eye, I saw the microaction of the transaction. The card enters the slot. The magnetic strip engages with a soft, mechanical rasp. The terminal screen displays, authorizing. The server at the Amex processing center pings the account. It finds the limit I set seconds ago. It sends back a digital no. On the terminal in Julian's hand, the light wouldn't be green. It would be a violent digital crimson. The word declined would pulse across the screen in block letters, a public indictment of his insolvency. Julian would blink. He would try again, telling the cashier there must be a mistake with the chip. He would swipe the backup card, the Chase Sapphire I'd also just restricted. Declined. He would try the business card for Synapse Innovation, the one tied to the funds he'd been embezzling. Declined. I watched my phone. A notification popped up from my banking app. Transaction denied. Whole Foods Market number 1024, $418.62. A slow, dark satisfaction coiled in my stomach. I took a sip of the vintage Krug champagne the hotel had left in my room. The bubbles were sharp and cold against my palate. 5 minutes later, my phone began to vibrate. It didn't stop. Julian, 1 missed call. Julian, 2 missed calls. Then the texts began to flood the screen, a digital avalanche of panic. Elena, pick up. Something is wrong with the cards. I'm at the store with the boys. I can't pay for the formula. Elena, this isn't funny. I have $400 worth of groceries here, and the boys are screaming. Everyone is staring at me. Pick up the phone. My business card is declined too. Did you do this? I didn't respond. I watched the messages scroll by, my expression as flat as the Ritz-Carlton's marble floors. Elena, please. Chloe won't answer her phone. My mother is in the car, and she's having a panic attack. The boys haven't eaten in 4 hours. They're starving. I lingered on that word, starving. I thought about the hospital bed in the future. I thought about the way Julian had checked his Rolex while my lungs were failing. I thought about how he'd called me a golden goose whose utility had expired. He wasn't worried about the babies starving. He was worried about the humiliation of the cashier's pity. He was worried about the fact that he couldn't play the hero if he couldn't pay the bill. I placed my thumb on the screen and swiped left. Delete. I opened a new window on my laptop. The forensic audit report Marcus Stone had sent over. It was a 200-page autopsy of our marriage. I scrolled down to the section titled Unexplained Cash Outflows. There it was, a $50,000 marketing expense from Julian's startup that had actually gone toward the down payment on Chloe's apartment. I highlighted the figure in a toxic neon yellow. I then opened an email draft addressed to Rowan Blackwell. Rowan, I typed, the keys clicking with a sharp, percussive rhythm. I hope you're enjoying your evening. Regarding Julian's series of funding, I've uncovered some irregularities in the Synapse Innovation ledger. Specifically, it appears your seed capital is being used to subsidize a private residence in the West Village. I've attached the wire transfer receipts. I hovered over the send button. In the hallway outside my suite, I heard the hushed tones of a guest laughing, the sound of ice clinking in a glass, the muffled luxury of a world Julian thought he was entitled to. I pressed send. The digital whoosh of the email departing was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut. Julian didn't know it yet, but the Amex Centurion being declined was the least of his problems. By tomorrow morning, he wouldn't just be unable to buy organic baby food. He would be answering to a man who didn't believe in family emergencies when his money was on the line. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The lights of the city were a sprawling, glittering horde. I wasn't the woman dying in the hospital anymore. I was the architect of the collapse. I picked up the house phone and pressed the button for the concierge. Ritz-Carlton, how may we assist you, Ms. Vance? I'd like to book a private table for one at per se tomorrow night, I said, my voice as smooth and cold as the champagne. And please have a bottle of the 1996 Dom Perignon waiting. I have a feeling I'll have a great deal to celebrate. I hung up and checked my personal laptop. A new notification appeared, a motion sensor alert from my penthouse's security system. I opened the feed. Julian was standing in my foyer, surrounded by groceries he'd clearly had to beg for or pay for with his mother's emergency cash. He was screaming at the security camera, his face a distorted mask of rage. But then a second figure appeared in the frame, a man in a suit, holding a legal envelope. The process server. Julian's rage turned into a look of absolute, hollow terror. The Capitol Grill on Wall Street was a cathedral of mahogany, dark leather, and the hushed, predatory murmurs of men who moved markets. It was a place where fortunes were dismantled over medium-rare steaks and 20-year-old scotch. I smoothed the lapel of my navy Alexander McQueen suit. The fabric was a wool-silk blend, crisp and impenetrable, a suit designed for the slaughterhouse of high finance. Rowan Blackwell was already seated in a corner booth, the shadows of the restaurant playing across his face like a predator in wait. Rowan was a kingmaker in the venture capital world. He didn't care about innovation or disruption. He cared about the internal rate of return and the ruthless protection of his limited partner's capital. "Elena," Rowan said, his voice a gravelly baritone. He didn't stand. He simply gestured to the seat opposite him. "You looked different on the Zoom call yesterday. Sharper. I like it. Death has a way of clarifying one's priorities, Rowan," I said, sliding into the booth. The leather squeaked under my weight, a supple, expensive sound. A waiter appeared instantly, placing a crystal tumbler of Baccarat glass on the table. I watched the microaction of the pour. The whiskey, a Macallan 25, cascaded over a single, perfectly clear sphere of ice. The condensation began to form immediately, a fine mist of cold silver clinging to the glass. I didn't touch it. I watched a single bead of water track down the side of the tumbler, a slow, rhythmic crawl that matched the clinical beat of my heart. "Your email," Rowan said, leaning forward. The scent of his expensive tobacco and aged leather filled the space between us. "You mentioned irregularities in Julian's seed funding allocation. That's a heavy accusation, Elena. Julian is your husband. His success is your success." "Julian is a ghost, Rowan," I said. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the forensic audit report. I didn't hand it to him. I placed it on the table and rested my palm on it. I could feel the texture of the high bond paper through my fingertips. And in finance, ghosts are liabilities. He hasn't been building a data encryption empire. He's been building a lifestyle for a mistress using your Series A capital. I slid the folder toward him. It moved across the polished wood with a soft paper-on-wax hiss. Rowan opened the folder. I watched his eyes. The pupils didn't dilate, they narrowed. He was a man who saw through spreadsheets like a radiologist saw through bone. He flipped through the pages, the sound of the paper sharp and percussive in the quiet restaurant. Transaction 4092, $50,000, marketing consultant Chloe Devereux. Transaction 5122, $12,000, corporate retreat, Cabo San Lucas private villa. Rowan's thumb paused on a wire transfer receipt. He used the corporate ledger to pay the security deposit on a West Village penthouse? For a consultant? A consultant with whom he has fathered 2 children, I said. My pulse remained perfectly flat. He's in a breach of fiduciary duty that would make a bankruptcy trustee weep. If the SEC catches wind of this before you pull your capital, your reputation as a disciplined investor is incinerated. The waiter arrived with our steaks. The scent of charred fat and rosemary hit the table, a primal, bloody aroma. I picked up the steak knife. It was a heavy piece of forged steel, the handle made of dark pacawood. I began the microaction of the cut. I pressed the tip of the blade into the center of the fillet. I felt the initial resistance of the seared crust, a dry, salty snap, before the steel slid into the tender, crimson center. I moved the knife in a slow, rhythmic sawing motion. I felt the fibers of the meat parting under the edge. The warm, iron-rich juice, the jus, flowed out across the white porcelain plate, a dark, spreading stain. I watched the blood-colored liquid reach the edge of a sprig of parsley. "Julian is a parasite, Rowan," I said, my voice as steady as the blade. "He's been feeding off my reputation and your capital. But parasites only survive as long as the host allows it." Rowan took a sip of his whiskey. He didn't look at the audit anymore. He looked at me. "What are you asking for, Elena? You didn't come here to save my money out of the goodness of your heart. I want a capital call, I said. I lifted a piece of the steak to my mouth. The meat was perfectly tender, the flavor of iron and salt exploding on my tongue. I chewed slowly, savoring the primal satisfaction of the kill. I want you to trigger the bad actor clause in the investment agreement. Pull the funding. Demand immediate repayment of the embezzled funds. Liquidate the assets. That kills the company, Rowan noted. The company is already a corpse, Rowan. I'm just asking you to stop the heart. Rowan leaned back, his silhouette a dark shadow against the mahogany walls. Julian told me you were taking a leave of absence to raise the twins. He said you were overwhelmed by the family tragedy. I felt a cold, sharp laugh bubble in my throat, but I didn't let it out. I merely set my knife down. The metal clinked against the plate, a sharp, final sound. Julian's greatest talent is his ability to narrate a fantasy, I said. But fantasies don't survive a forensic audit. He's currently sitting in my penthouse, which he no longer owns, with 2 children he can't afford, waiting for a wire transfer that is never coming. Rowan reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek, black smartphone. I watched his thumb hover over the screen. He was the judge, and Julian was the defendant who hadn't even been told he was on trial. Consider it done, Rowan said. He tapped the screen with a decisive rhythmic click. I'm sending the notice of default to his board and the legal team now. By tomorrow morning, Synapse Innovation will be under a lockdown. We'll freeze his business accounts and initiate a clawback on all unauthorized expenses. And the mistress's apartment? I asked. The lease is in the company name, Rowan said, a dark, predatory smile touching his lips. I'll have the locks changed by sunset. If she wants her things, she can pick them up from the sidewalk. I picked up my whiskey tumbler. The glass was freezing, the condensation wetting my palm. I raised it toward Rowan. To liquidity, I said. To a clean exit, Rowan replied. The crystal glasses touched with a high-pitched, musical ping that resonated through the booth. I took a sip of the Macallan. The smoke and peat burned my throat, a glorious cleansing fire. As I walked out of the Capitol Grill and onto the bustling sidewalk of Wall Street, the cool October wind whipped my hair across my face. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification from the Synapse corporate Slack channel, which I still had access to. Julian Sterling at channel. There seems to be a glitch with the payroll account. Please hold all outgoing wires. I'm resolving it with the bank now. I stopped on the sidewalk, watching the tide of gray suits and yellow taxis. I began to type a reply, not to the channel, but a private message to Julian. It isn't a glitch, Julian. It's an autopsy. Enjoy the motel. I hit send, and watched the message status change to delivered. I didn't wait for a response. I hailed a taxi, the yellow door swinging open like the jaws of a beast, and stepped inside. I was no longer the woman who died in silence. I was the one who pulled the plug. I leaned back in the taxi and opened my iPad. Harrison, my PI, had sent a new video file. It was a doorbell cam from Chloe's West Village apartment. 2 men in suits, Rowan's security team, were standing at the door, holding a legal notice. Behind them, a locksmith was already kneeling, his tools glinting in the afternoon sun. Chloe was screaming, holding Lucas in one arm and a designer handbag in the other. But the most satisfying part? Julian's car was pulled up at the curb, and he was watching his entire secondary life being loaded into a dumpster. The lobby of my apartment building smelled of mahogany and old money, a scent I had paid millions to secure. But as the elevator doors slid open on the penthouse floor, a new toxic odor hit me. It was the smell of a dying marriage, sour formula, the metallic tang of unwashed laundry, and the cloying sweet rot of discarded takeout. I stepped out onto the marble landing. Beside me stood Marcus Stone, his charcoal suit as sharp as a razor, and 2 NYPD officers whose presence felt like an icy draft in the overheated hallway. One officer, a veteran with a face like etched granite, held a folder containing the writ of possession. I didn't knock. I used my master key. The mechanical thud of the deadbolt retracting sounded like a gunshot in the silent hallway. I pushed the door open. The foyer was a graveyard of luxury. My $50,000 Persian rug was stained with a dark, sprawling blotch of what looked like grape juice. A designer diaper bag. A $3,000 gift from Julian to Chloe, purchased with my credit card. Lay agape on the console table, spilling its plastic contents like the guts of a slaughtered animal. Elena! Julian's voice came from the living room. It was a ragged, hollow sound. I walked into the main space. The floor-to-ceiling windows, which usually offered a triumphant view of the park, were smeared with greasy handprints. Julian was standing by the sofa, wearing the same silk shirt he'd had on 3 days ago. It was wrinkled, the collar limp and yellowed with sweat. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. Beatrice was slumped in a velvet armchair, her Mikomoto pearls tangled in the collar of a stained housecoat. She was clutching a lukewarm cup of tea, her eyes wide and bloodshot. The twins were in a portable playpen in the center of the room, their cries reduced to a weary, rhythmic whimpering. "The 48 hours are up, Julian," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The silence of the room acted as an amplifier. I watched the microaction of Julian's reaction. His throat constricted, a sharp, bobbing movement of his Adam's apple. His hands, usually so steady when he was pouring wine or spinning lies, began to tremble. He looked at the police officers, then at the legal folder in the veteran's hand. "Elena, please," Julian stammered, taking a step toward me. The officer immediately shifted his weight, his heavy leather duty belt creaking. A sharp, warning sound of authority. Julian froze. "The bank, there was a mistake. Synapse is under some kind of review. I can't access the accounts. I have no liquid assets, Elena. I can't even pay for a U-Haul." "That sounds like a summary judgment of your life, Julian," I said. I walked to the kitchen island. I picked up a bone china saucer that was sitting in a pool of dried milk. I felt the grit of the residue against my fingertips. I let the saucer slip. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, musical shatter, white porcelain shards skittering across the room. Beatrice shrieked, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. 10 minutes, the veteran officer said, his voice a low, rhythmic drone. "You have 10 minutes to gather your essential personal effects. Anything left after that will be considered abandoned property and disposed of by the owner." "Abandoned property?" Beatrice wailed, standing up. "This is our home. You can't treat us like squatters." "You are squatters, Beatrice," I said, my gaze moving to her. "You have no lease. You have no equity. And as of 8:05 a.m. this morning, you have no legal right to stand on this floor." I watched Julian scramble. It was a pathetic, frantic dance. He began grabbing things, his gold watch box, a stack of designer shirts, a silver-framed photo of himself. He didn't grab the baby's clothes. He didn't grab Beatrice's medication. He grabbed the totems of the wealth he was losing. I stood by the window, watching the countdown on my phone. The digital numbers flipped, 8:11, 8:12. The scent of panic in the room was palpable, a sharp, acidic musk that cut through the sour milk. Julian was hyperventilating, his breaths coming in short, jagged gasps. He tried to zip a suitcase, the metal teeth of the zipper snagging on a silk tie. He cursed, his voice cracking, a high-pitched sound of a man who had realized the trap was fully closed. "Time's up," the officer said. "Wait, just 5 more minutes." Julian shouted, his face a distorted mask of desperation. "I need to call Chloe. She's not answering. I need her to pick us up." "Chloe won't be picking anyone up, Julian," I said. I pulled my iPad from my briefcase and turned the screen toward him. "Rowan Blackwell executed the termination clause on your business lease 2 hours ago. The locksmith has already finished with the West Village apartment. Chloe is currently sitting on a sidewalk in Lower Manhattan with a mountain of luggage and a very expensive stroller." Julian stopped. He dropped the suitcase. The sound of the heavy leather hitting the floor was the sound of his final defeat. He looked at the screen, at the photo my PI had sent of Chloe surrounded by trash bags, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. You destroyed everything," Julian whispered. "I didn't destroy anything, Julian," I said, my voice as cold as the glass behind me. "I simply stopped subsidized the lie. You were the architect of this empire. I just performed the final safety inspection." The officers moved in. It was a clinical, efficient process. They didn't use force, they used the weight of their presence. They guided Beatrice toward the door, her sobbing a shrill, rhythmic accompaniment to the squeak of their boots. Julian was last. He picked up the baby carriers, his knuckles white against the plastic handles. He looked back at the room, at the $15 million view, the mahogany built-ins, the life he had tried to steal. I stood perfectly still as he passed me. I didn't offer a word of comfort. I didn't even look at the children. My pulse was a flat, unshakable line. As the door swung shut behind them, the silence that rushed into the apartment was immense. It was a physical weight, a thick, luxurious velvet that muffled the world. I walked into the center of the room. I felt the grit of the porcelain shards under my heels. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted key fob, the master control for the apartment's smart system. I pressed reset. Immediately, the lights flickered, the thermostat hummed, and the electronic locks on every cabinet and closet engaged with a series of sharp, mechanical clicks. The Julian Sterling era was being purged from the digital soul of the building. I walked to the sofa and sat down. I picked up my phone and dialed Alexander Thorne's private line. Alex was the only lawyer in Manhattan more dangerous than Marcus Stone. He was a man who didn't care about the law as much as he cared about the absolute, crushing victory of his clients. Elena. Alex's voice was a smooth, low-frequency hum. I heard the purge was successful. The parasites have been removed, Alex, I said. I leaned back, looking at the gray Manhattan sky. Now, I want to talk about the criminal trespassing and embezzlement charges. I don't just want him out of my house. I want him in a cell. Consider it done, Alex said. I'll have the filing on your desk by noon. I hung up. I closed my eyes and breathed in. The sour smell was still there, but it was fading. Soon I would have the cleaners here. They would scrub the floors with bleach and lemon. They would burn the furniture. They would erase every atom of Julian's presence. I wasn't the woman who died alone in a hospital bed. I was the woman who had reclaimed her kingdom. And the best part, I was only just getting started. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. On the counter lay Julian's forgotten wedding ring, a circle of cold platinum he'd left in his panic. I picked it up, feeling the weight of the metal. I walked to the trash chute in the hallway, opened the heavy steel door, and let the ring drop. I didn't wait to hear it hit the bottom. My phone buzzed, a message from Harrison. Subject is at the Queen's Motel. He's arguing with the manager over the security deposit. Want the audio? I smiled. Turn it up, I replied. The rain over Queens was a gray, industrial wash, turning the skyline into a blurred charcoal sketch. I sat in the back of my car, a black Mercedes Maybach, the interior smelling of fresh leather and cold, silent efficiency. On my lap, the iPad glowed with a grainy, high-definition feed from Harrison's telephoto lens. I wasn't just watching a video. I was witnessing a liquidation of a different kind. The Starlight Motel was a bruised purple building huddled under the shadow of the Long Island Expressway. Its neon sign flickered with a rhythmic, dying buzz, beezity-snap, casting a sickly pink light over the oil-slicked puddles of the parking lot. In my previous life, I didn't even know places like this existed within city limits. Now I found the squalor poetic. Julian was visible through the rain-streaked window of room 114. The PI's thermal imaging showed 3 figures, Julian, Beatrice, and the 2 small, heat-emitting clusters that were the twins. Julian was standing by a laminate desk, his silhouette slumped. I watched the microaction of his despair. He reached for a plastic cup, his fingers trembling so violently that the cheap water inside sloshed over the rim. He wiped the desk with a frantic, obsessive motion, as if cleaning the surface could somehow sanitize the catastrophe of his life. Beatrice was a shadow in the corner, her head buried in her hands. The Mikimoto pearls were gone, pawned, according to Harrison's latest report, to cover the first week's incidental deposit and a pack of blood pressure medication. Then a pair of headlights cut through the gloom. A white BMW X5, another marketing expense from Synapse Innovation, slid into the parking lot. The engine's low, expensive hum was a foreign language in this neighborhood. I watched Chloe Devereux step out of the car. She was wearing a trench coat that cost more than Julian's current annual earning potential. She didn't look like a woman in love. She looked like a petitioner preparing to serve a respondent. She walked to the trunk. The mechanical whir of the automated liftgate was audible even through the PI's dampened microphone. Chloe reached inside and pulled out a double stroller, a bugaboo donkey, the sleek black frame glinting in the neon light. It was an artifact of the life she had tried to steal from me. Julian, open the damn door. Chloe's voice was a sharp, percussive strike against the sound of the rain. Julian scrambled to the door. I watched his face as he opened it, a mask of pathetic, desperate hope. He reached for her, his hands outstretched like a drowning man, but Chloe stepped back. She didn't just avoid his touch, she recoiled from it. I can't do this, Julian, Chloe said. She wasn't crying. Her voice had the cold, transactional weight of a class action settlement. Colin found the files. He saw the custody orders. He knows I lied about my history. He's already filed for a restraining order and canceled the lease on the West Village place. Chloe, wait. Julian's voice was a ragged plea, muffled by the downpour. No, Chloe snapped. She grabbed the handle of the stroller and shoved it forward. The wheels hit the metal doorframe with a sharp, plastic thwack. These are your boys. You wanted the Sterling legacy? You got it. I didn't ruin my body for 9 months to end up in a roach trap in Queens. The micro-action of the abandonment was exquisite. Chloe didn't look at the twins. She didn't even look at Julian's face. She turned on her heel, her designer boots clicking against the wet asphalt, a rapid, rhythmic retreat. She hopped back into the BMW, the heavy door closing with a solid, Germanic thud that signaled the end of Julian's secondary escape route. The car roared to life. I watched the red taillights fade into the gray mist of the expressway, leaving Julian standing in the doorway of room 114, the double stroller sitting halfway inside the room like a Trojan horse of pure misery. "She's gone," Julian whispered. I could hear him clearly through the PI's bug. She just left them. Beatrice emerged from the shadows of the room, her voice a shrill, hysterical shriek. "What do you mean she left them? Julian, we have no money. We have no formula. My back is seizing up. You have to call Elena. You have to tell her you're sorry. Tell her we'll do whatever she wants." Julian didn't answer. He walked to the stroller. I watched him look down at Oliver and Lucas. In my first life, these boys were the light of my world. Now they were merely the physical evidence of Julian's breach of contract. He reached down and touched the polyester fabric of the stroller's sun canopy. His hand was shaking. He looked at the motel room, the peeling wallpaper, the stained carpet, the flickering light of the bathroom that smelled of mildew and cheap cigarettes. "She won't answer, Mother," Julian said, his voice flat and hollow. Elena is the one who sent the files to Colin. She's the one who triggered the clawback on the seed money. She isn't coming to save us. She's the one who burned the bridge while we were still standing on it. A clinical satisfaction settled in my chest, cold and precise. I tapped the screen of the iPad, closing the video feed. The digital darkness that followed was a profound relief. I leaned back into the Maybach's mohair cushions and looked out at the rain. In my previous life, Julian had watched me die in a sterile ward, his only concern being the reservation at Le Bernardin. He had viewed my life as a series of assets to be liquidated. Now, I was the primary physical custodian of his fate, and my verdict was total. He was trapped. He was broke. And he was legally obligated to raise 2 children who would grow up to despise him, just as they had grown up to despise me. It was a perfect, self-sustaining loop of karmic debt. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus Stone. "Elena, I've just filed the paperwork for the arrearages on your personal loans to Julian. If he doesn't pay within 30 days, which we know he can't, we move to garnish any future wages. He'll be living below the poverty line for the next decade." "Perfect," I replied. "Ensure the process server finds him at the motel. I want the neighbors to see it." I put the phone away and picked up my glass of sparkling water. The bubbles were sharp and cold. "Where to, Ms. Vance?" the driver asked, his voice a discreet hum. "The Hamptons," I said. "I want to see the sunset over the Atlantic. I hear the air is much cleaner there." As the Maybach glided away from the curb, I looked back at the Starlight Motel one last time. The neon sign finally gave out, plunging Julian's room into absolute darkness. He thought he was a player in a grand drama. He didn't realize he was just a line item I had successfully deleted. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the architect of the silence. Chapter and hook. The car hit the open road, the rhythmic thrum-thrum of the tires on the asphalt acting as a lullaby for my new life. But as I closed my eyes, a final notification appeared on my Apple Watch, an alert from my firm's security team. "Elena, we've flagged a series of desperate LinkedIn messages from Julian Sterling to your new fiancé, Alex Thorne. He's claiming extenuating circumstances and begging for a job as a paralegal." I felt a sharp, cold laugh bubble in my throat. I didn't even need to reply. I knew exactly how Alex handled beggars. The 5th floor of Saks Fifth Avenue was a sanctuary of hushed, elite commerce. The air smelled of expensive jasmine, supple calfskin, and the invisible ozone of a multi-million-dollar credit limit. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden rectangles on the polished Italian marble floors. I was no longer the 24-year-old fighting for her survival. I was 30, a high-net-worth individual featured in Forbes, and the master of my own universe. I sat on a velvet divan, a crystal baccarat flute in my hand. I watched the micro-action of the champagne. A single, thin thread of tiny, luminous bubbles rose from the bottom of the glass, a rhythmic, relentless ascent that mirrored my own trajectory. The liquid was ice-cold against my lips, sharp and dry. Alex Thorne stood before the three-way mirror. The master tailor, a gray-haired Italian man with measuring tape draped around his neck like a stole, was making microscopic adjustments to Alex's bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo. Alex looked exactly like what he was, a billionaire corporate litigator who ate competitors for breakfast. His shoulders were broad, his posture radiating a quiet, unshakable authority that Julian had only ever been able to mimic. He didn't need to brag about his status. The status was woven into the very fabric of his presence. "How does the shoulder feel, Mr. Thorne?" the tailor asked, his voice a deferential murmur. "Perfect," Alex said. He turned, looking at me through the mirror. A slow, genuine smile touched his lips, a smile of mutual respect and absolute certainty. "What do you think, Elena? Does it suit a winter wedding? You look like a man who is about to close the biggest merger of his life," I said, raising my glass in a silent toast. "And I happen to be the target acquisition." Alex laughed, the sound low and rich, a frequency that resonated pleasantly in my chest. Suddenly, the tranquil silence of the floor was shattered. From behind the heavy velvet curtain of the delivery area, a sharp, clattering crash echoed across the marble. It was followed by a rough, exhausted grunt, and the sound of heavy plastic garment bags sliding across the floor. "Watch it," the floor manager hissed, his voice slicing through the air with a venom reserved for the lower classes. "Those are custom orders for a brand ambassador. Pick them up. Pick them up now." I'm sorry, sir," a voice stammered. The voice was like a ghost reaching out of a shallow grave. It was a sound that sent a cold, clinical electric shock straight down my spine. I didn't flinch. My pulse remained a steady, flat line. I slowly turned my head. Kneeling on the marble floor, surrounded by heavy black garment bags, was a man in a faded brown uniform with a frayed patch on the shoulder that read Express Logistics. It was Julian. He was unrecognizable. The silver fox aesthetic he had spent thousands to maintain in his 20s had been replaced by the brutal, accelerated aging of the working poor. His hair was thin and patchy, graying in a way that looked like ash rather than style. His skin was the color of wet cardboard, lined with deep, permanent furrows of stress and chronic exhaustion. He was 30, but he looked 45. His shoulders were permanently hunched, the posture of a beast of burden broken by the weight of a life he had never been equipped to live. I watched him. My reaction was entirely clinical. I felt the same detached curiosity I might afford to a dead insect on the sidewalk. There was no anger left, no burning desire to hurt him. The universe was already doing a far more efficient job than I ever could. Julian reached for a bag. As he pulled it toward him, his eyes lifted. They met mine. Time didn't just slow down, it ground to a halt, the frame-by-frame reality of the moment expanding into hyperdefinition. I watched the realization hit him. First came the widening of his pupils, a sudden, dark dilation of pure shock. Then the involuntary drop of his jaw, his mouth falling open like a landed fish. I watched the skin of his face turn a sick, translucent gray. He looked at my camel hair coat, at the glowing, flawless health of my skin, at the massive 3-carat emerald-cut diamond ring glittering on my finger. Then his gaze shifted to Alex, who was standing tall and powerful in his $10,000 tuxedo, looking down at the fallen courier with a slight, bored frown. I saw the exact moment Julian's soul finally broke. It was the realization that this life of absolute luxury, power, and genuine partnership was exactly the life he had murdered in the other timeline. He was looking at the gold he had thrown away in exchange for a handful of dirt. "Elena," he whispered. His voice cracked, a dry, pathetic sound in the opulent room. He didn't get up. He remained on his knees among the garment bags, looking up at me like a beggar looking at a queen. "Elena, please," Julian choked out, a tear suddenly tracking through the grime on his cheek. "It's me, Julian. I just need a minute. My mother is dead. The boys, they're so hard, Elena. They scream at me that I'm a loser. I have nothing left. Please, you always knew how to fix things." The pure, terrifying audacity of his narcissism was almost impressive. Even now, kneeling in the dirt of his own making, he expected the woman he had betrayed to reach down and save him simply because it was convenient for him. Alex stepped forward, placing a protective, heavy hand on the small of my back. "Is there a problem here, Elena?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave into the register he used when destroying opposing counsel in court. I didn't blink. I didn't let a single emotion ripple across the surface of my face. I looked at Julian for another 3 seconds, observing the sweat on his collar and the yellowing of his eyes. "No problem at all, darling," I said, my voice smooth, cold, and perfectly modulated for the high-end retail environment. I turned my gaze back to my fiancé. It just seems a delivery driver has confused me with someone else. Julian let out a small, strangled sound, a gasp of pure, unadulterated agony that was immediately cut off as the floor manager stepped between us. "Sir, you need to leave the floor immediately, or I am calling building security," the manager hissed, grabbing Julian by the arm and hauling him to his feet. "You are causing a disturbance and making our clients uncomfortable." I didn't watch as they dragged Julian toward the service elevator. I didn't listen to his muffled, desperate pleas fading down the hallway. I turned back to Alex. I picked up my baccarat flute and took a slow, deliberate sip of the champagne. The bubbles were crisp. The taste was perfect. "Now," I said, looking Alex up and down in the mirror, my smile returning like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Let's talk about the lapels. I think the silk needs to be just a fraction of an inch wider to match your shoulders." Chapter end hook. We left Saks 30 minutes later, walking out into the crisp Fifth Avenue air. Alex's arm was locked in mine, his strength a steady, comforting presence. But as the doorman opened the door to our waiting car, my phone buzzed with an encrypted alert from Harrison. He'd found Chloe. She was in a small town in Ohio, operating under a false name, and was currently wining and dining a new, wealthy tech developer. I smiled. Julian was crushed. Now it was time to finish the autopsy on his accomplice. The night was a vast, velvet void outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. At 30, the city didn't look like a playground anymore. It looked like a ledger. I sat in my darkened office, the only light emanating from the sleek, blue-white glow of my iPad Pro. The screen reflected in the pupils of my eyes, a digital ghost of the girl who had once died in a hospital bed. I was no longer just a quant. I was a master of reputation management. But tonight, I wasn't protecting a brand. I was dismantling one. I tapped the file titled CHLOE_Devereaux_high_ology. The microaction of the scroll was hypnotic. I watched the images flicker past. Chloe in a conservative beige wrap dress, Chloe at a local charity gala in a small town outside Columbus, Chloe laughing over a glass of Chardonnay with a man who looked like a younger, more naive version of Julian. His name was Colin Reed. He was an algorithm architect who had just cashed out of a fintech startup for $40 million. He was exactly Chloe's type. High liquidity, low emotional intelligence, and a desperate need for a distressed maiden to rescue. I watched a video clip Harrison had captured from a hidden camera in a restaurant. Chloe was leaning across the table, her eyes wide and glistening with faked tears. Julian was a monster. Her voice came through my Bose speakers, crisp and clear. He used his mother's illness to trap me. He stole my savings. I had to run away with nothing but the clothes on my back. I've never even been pregnant, Colin. I was too afraid to bring a child into that house. A cold, sharp laugh bubbled in my throat. I watched her hand, the same hand that had shoved a double stroller into a rain-soaked motel room, reach out and touch Colin's arm with a delicate, trembling grace. "The audacity of her wire fraud is almost artistic," I whispered to the empty room. I minimized the video and opened the final dossier Harrison had compiled. It was a masterpiece of forensic evidence. I had the background check that Chloe had successfully bypassed by using her mother's maiden name. I had the DNA test results from the twins. I had the physical custody orders signed by a New York judge, proving she had abandoned 2 infants in a motel. And most importantly, I had the bank statements showing she had received $50,000 in embezzled seed money from Julian's defunct company. I turned my attention to Colin Reed's professional life. He was preparing for a massive IPO. As part of the standard due diligence process, his executive board had hired a third-party auditing firm to vet any significant others who might pose a liability to the company's public image. I knew the lead auditor at that firm. We had worked together on the Lehman liquidation. I began to compose the email. My fingers moved across the glass screen with a rhythmic, percussive tap, the sound of a firing squad preparing their rifles. To Senior Auditor Miller and Associates. Subject, urgent. Due diligence flag, Colin Reed/Chloe Bennett. Regarding the background vetting for the Reed Tech IPO. Please find attached a comprehensive file regarding the individual currently known as Chloe Bennett, aka Chloe Devereaux. Documents include legal evidence of corporate embezzlement, child abandonment, and a standing restraining order from a previous landlord in Manhattan. I attached the files. I watched the progress bar as the digital poison began its ascent into the cloud. 20%, 50%, 85%. The scent of my office, expensive leather, high-end electronics, and the faint, bitter aroma of the espresso I'd finished an hour ago, felt like a shield. I wasn't the victim of Chloe's lies anymore. I was the curator of her truth. I hovered my thumb over the send button. In my mind's eye, I saw the microaction of the strike. The email hits the auditor's inbox at 9 a.m. By 10 a.m., the board of directors is in an emergency session. By noon, Colin Reed is being presented with a choice: his $40 million IPO or the distressed maiden in the beige wrap dress. A man like Colin doesn't choose love. He chooses the exit strategy. I pressed send. The sharp click of the digital confirmation was a final, rhythmic punctuation to Chloe's secondary life. I leaned back, my pulse a perfectly flat line. I closed my eyes and visualized the aftermath in Ohio. I saw Colin standing in his white marble kitchen, the printouts of the PI report scattered across the island like confetti from a funeral. I saw Chloe coming home from her yoga class, her face glowing with the smug satisfaction of a successful hunt. I saw the moment Colin's face turned to stone as he handed her the cease and desist notice and the eviction papers for the townhouse he'd been subsidizing. "I didn't abandon them," Chloe would scream, her facade shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. "I was a victim. Julian forced me." But Colin would see the bank statements. He would see the $50,000 wire transfer. He would see the face of a woman who viewed children as collateral. By the end of the week, Chloe would be exactly where Julian was, at the bottom of the barrel. With no degrees, a ruined reputation, and a standing indictment for her role in the Synapse Innovation embezzlement, she would be forced back to the only place that would take her: the tiny, gray hometown in the Rust Belt she had spent her life trying to escape. I opened my iPad one last time and checked a final, grainy photo from Harrison. It was Chloe, 2 days later, sitting at a bus station in Columbus. Her designer handbag was scuffed, her eyes were hollow, and she was clutching a plastic bag of her remaining belongings. She looked like a ghost. "Liquidation complete," I whispered. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The lights of Manhattan were a sprawling, glittering horde of survivors. Somewhere out there, Julian was delivering packages in the rain. Somewhere in Ohio, Chloe was realizing that her beauty had finally reached its expiration date. I picked up my phone and called Alex. "It's done," I said, my voice as cold and clear as the night air. "The auditors have the files. Chloe Devereux is officially a persona non grata in the tech world." "Excellent work, Elena," Alex replied, his voice a low-frequency hum of satisfaction. "Now we have a wedding to finalize. The Hamptons estate is ready. The caterers have the 1996 Dom Perignon. Are you ready to close this chapter?" "I closed it 24 years ago, Alex," I said, looking at my reflection in the glass. "I'm just finally getting around to signing the decree." I hung up. I felt a profound, unshakable peace. The parasites were gone. The debt was collected. And the best part? I was still young enough to enjoy the empire I had built on their ashes. I walked out of my office and into my bedroom, where my wedding dress, a Vera Wang masterpiece of silk and lace, hung like a silent white sentinel. I touched the fabric, feeling the cool, luxurious weight of the future. But then, a final notification appeared on my smart mirror. A news alert from a local Ohio paper. Diner waitress arrested for identity fraud and petty theft. I didn't even need to open the link. I knew the face. I knew the story. And I knew, finally, that the flatline was complete. The air in the Hamptons didn't just taste like salt. It tasted like an infinite horizon. It was a crisp, sharp Atlantic breeze that carried the scent of crushed beach grass, cold kelp, and the invisible weight of old money estates. I sat on the cedar deck of our oceanfront property, a sprawling, glass-and-stone fortress of wealth preservation that Alex and I had consolidated into our joint trust. In front of me, the sun was performing its final act of the day. The sky was a bruised palette of deep violets and liquid gold, the colors bleeding into the white-capped surf of the Atlantic. I watched the microaction of the tide. The water surged forward, a cold, rhythmic power that smoothed the sand, erasing every footprint, every scar, every trace of what had come before. It was a natural liquidate and clear protocol. I held a glass of 1996 Dom Perignon. The flute was cold, the condensation wetting my palm in a way that felt like a baptism. I watched a single bubble rise, a tiny silver sphere of carbonation that moved with a relentless, upward trajectory until it broke the surface and vanished into the air. "She's finally asleep," a voice said, a low, resonant frequency that settled the remaining static in my soul. Alex Thorne walked onto the deck, his footsteps a solid, rhythmic thud against the weather-beaten cedar. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in a charcoal cashmere sweater, his sleeves pushed back to reveal the forearms of a man who spent his weekends sailing and his weekdays winning. He didn't look like a husband. He looked like a managing partner of my heart. He leaned against the railing beside me, the scent of sea salt and his sandalwood soap surrounding me. He placed a hand on the small of my back, a heavy protective weight that required no reciprocation. Unlike Julian, Alex didn't need me to be his golden goose. He had his own empire, his own legacy-building strategy. We were a power couple in the truest, most clinical sense of the word. Charlotte was asking about the silver bells again, Alex said, a soft smile touching his lips. The waves, I whispered. I looked back through the floor-to-ceiling glass doors. Inside, in a nursery filled with hand-carved rocking horses and a library of first-edition children's books, our 2-year-old daughter, Charlotte, was a small, warm bundle of dreams. She was brilliant, fire-eyed, and loved with a ferocity that was ironclad. She wasn't a tool for a trust fund or a pawn in a mistress's game. She was the future I had stolen back from the void. I turned my attention to the iPad Pro sitting on the small marble table beside me. One final task. One final audit. I opened the last report from Harrison. It was a digital dossier of Julian's current existence, an autopsy of a man who was still walking. I scrolled through the photos. Julian was 33 now, but in the grainy telephoto shots he looked like a man in his late 50s. He was standing outside a gray, dilapidated apartment building in a part of Queens where the sirens never stopped. He was wearing a threadbare coat, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to hide the tremors. The report was a masterpiece of karmic symmetry. Julian was working 2 jobs, a night shift as a warehouse supervisor and a day shift as a delivery driver. Every cent he earned was immediately diverted. Arrearages for the loans I had called in, child support for the twins that Chloe had legally tethered to him, and the mounting medical bills for his own failing health. He was living exactly the life he had once designed for me. He was the slave to a family that despised him. Harrison had included an audio clip from a bug in Julian's kitchen. I pressed play. The sound was a chaotic, high-decibel assault. Oliver and Lucas were 12 now. I heard the sound of a chair being kicked, the smash of a cheap ceramic plate. "You're a loser, Dad." Oliver's voice was a jagged, adolescent shriek, devoid of any empathy. "Why can't we have the new iPhones? Why is the heat turned off again? You ruined our lives. Why didn't you marry someone with money?" "I did," I heard Julian whisper, his voice a broken, hollow rasp. "I did, but I was too stupid to keep her." The sound of a slap followed, one of the boys hitting the table, and then Julian's weary, rhythmic sobbing. It was the exact sound of a man realizing he was the architect of his own hell. I watched the microaction of my own hand as I reached out and touched the delete icon. The system prompted, "Are you sure you want to permanently delete this file? This action cannot be undone." My pulse remained a perfectly flat, unshakable 60 beats per minute. I looked at the sunset, at the infinite Atlantic, at the man standing beside me who actually knew my worth. I thought about the hospital bed, the ozone smell of the ventilator, and the cold jerk of the power cord. 25 years of stolen life had been reclaimed. The debt was collected. The interest was paid in full. I tapped confirm. The screen flickered for a millisecond before the file vanished into a vacuum of pixels. The Julian Sterling chapter was officially liquidated. There were no more ghosts in the machine. No more parasites in the blood. I closed the iPad lid. The sound, a soft leather-bound snap, was the most satisfying mic drop of my 2 lifetimes. "Everything okay?" Alex asked, his gaze tracing the profile of my face. "Perfect," I said. I set the glass down and turned to him. I reached up and ran my thumb along the line of his jaw. His skin was warm, vibrant, and real. I was just finalizing a termination decree. "The project is closed." Alex nodded, understanding the professional shorthand for my personal victory. He took my hand, his fingers interlocking with mine, the heavy weight of our shared future settling over us like the evening mist. "The 1996 Dom is holding up well," he noted, gesturing to the bottle. "It's a vintage of resilience," I said. I leaned my head against his shoulder. The ocean continued its work below us, the waves crashing against the shore in a rhythmic, eternal pulse. Hiss, crash, thrum. Hiss, crash, thrum. It was a soundtrack of power, not of a ventilator. I wasn't the woman who died alone. I was the architect of a sovereign empire. I had looked into the abyss of a man's greed and decided to build a skyscraper over it. I looked out at the dark water, where the last sliver of the sun had disappeared. In the silence of the Hamptons' night, I felt the absolute, unshakable peace of a woman who had rewritten the stars. Death had tried to make me a footnote in a tragedy. Rebirth had given me the pen. And as I stood there in the arms of a man who was my equal, I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't the motels, or the debt, or the poverty I had inflicted on my enemies. The greatest revenge was the fact that I no longer cared enough to watch them suffer. I had walked away, and in walking away, I had become untouchable. "Let's go inside," I whispered. "I want to be there when Charlotte wakes up for her midnight water." "Always," Alex said. We walked back into the warmth of the glass and stone house, the heavy doors closing with a solid airtight click. The sovereign empire was secure. The script was finished. And as the lights of the estate flickered on, illuminating the path forward, I knew one thing with absolute, clinical certainty. The flatline was over. My life had finally begun. I sat in the nursery, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of my daughter's chest. I thought of the millions of women who feel the plug being pulled every day, by ungrateful partners, by parasitic families, by a world that demands their sacrifice. To you I say this, the cord can be reconnected. The script can be rewritten. If you found power in my journey, click subscribe, leave a comment about your own sovereign moment. And remember, the most powerful move you can ever make is to walk away and build your own empire. See you in the next story.